Ethan gasped awake, his chest rising and falling in rapid succession. The morning light filtered through his curtains, casting long shadows over his room. Something was different. He could feel it in the way the air around him pulsed, in the way his body tingled with an unfamiliar energy. He pushed himself upright, rubbing his temples as a dull ache pressed against his skull. The dream he had just woken from still clung to his mind like mist, vague yet persistent. It had been filled with voices whispering in a language he didn't recognize, images of flickering lights and shifting shadows. But what struck him the most was the sense of power surging through him even in sleep. He shook his head, dismissing the strange feeling, and swung his legs over the side of the bed. As soon as his feet touched the floor, the wooden planks beneath him vibrated. Ethan froze. The air in his room felt thick, charged with something unseen. He reached out instinctively, placing a hand against his nightstand. The moment his fingers brushed the surface, it trembled, as if responding to his touch. He yanked his hand back and stared at it. His fingers looked the same, his skin unmarked. But something had changed. He stood and took a hesitant step forward. The floor shifted slightly, not enough to be alarming, but enough to confirm that he wasn't imagining things. A thrill shot through him. He stretched out his arms and willed the energy within him to move. The room reacted. His curtains fluttered as if caught in an unseen breeze. His books vibrated on their shelves, and a pulse of air rippled outward from his body. His breath hitched. His mind raced with possibilities. Was this real? Was he dreaming? He needed to test it. He focused on a pencil lying on his desk. He reached toward it, his fingers curling ever so slightly, and to his astonishment, the pencil rolled toward him. He gasped, heart pounding in his chest. He spent the next hour experimenting, testing the limits of this newfound power. He found that when he concentrated hard enough, objects moved at his will. The stronger his focus, the greater the force. He could make his chair slide across the room, send his books toppling from their shelves, and even create a small gust of wind with a flick of his fingers. It was exhilarating and terrifying all at once. The sound of his mother calling from downstairs broke his trance. He quickly straightened his room, using his hands instead of his mind, unwilling to let anyone know what was happening just yet. As he hurried down the stairs, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just changed forever. School was a blur. He couldn't focus on his lessons, not when his mind was consumed with his new abilities. Every movement felt different now. Every breath he took charged with an energy he didn't fully understand. He was careful, making sure not to attract attention, but it wasn't easy. His emotions seemed to be linked to his power, and whenever he got too excited or frustrated, he felt the air ripple around him. At lunch, he sat alone, staring at his hands, lost in thought. His best friend, Liam, plopped down beside him, nudging his shoulder. "You okay, man? You've been acting weird all day." Ethan hesitated. He trusted Liam more than anyone, but how could he explain something like this? "Yeah, just didn't sleep well," he lied. Liam studied him, then shrugged. "You look like you've seen a ghost or something. Want to hang out after school? Might take your mind off whatever's bugging you." Ethan nodded, grateful for the distraction. "Yeah, sure." After school, they headed to the park as they often did. The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden hues over the trees. They sat on the grass, talking about nothing in particular. For a while, Ethan almost forgot about his powers. Almost. At one point, Liam tossed a rock into the air, watching it arc before hitting the ground. Without thinking, Ethan flicked his fingers. The next rock Liam threw stopped midair, hovering for a split second before dropping. Liam blinked, then turned to Ethan. "What the?" Did you see that? Ethan's heart pounded. He hadn't meant to do that. See what? He asked, feigning ignorance. The rock. It just... Liam waved his hands. It stopped, man. Like, midair. Ethan swallowed hard. He could lie. He could deny it. But the look on Liam's face told him he wouldn't let it go. So instead he took a deep breath and held out his hand. With a small gesture, he sent a nearby leaf spiraling upward before letting it drift back down. Liam's mouth fell open. Dude, what was that? Ethan sighed. I don't know. Liam stared at him, then grinned. That's awesome. Ethan let out a breath of relief. He had expected fear, disbelief, but instead, Liam looked thrilled. They spent the next hour testing his abilities, throwing rocks, sticks, anything they could find, and watching as Ethan manipulated them. He still didn't fully understand how it worked, but with each attempt he felt more in control. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they headed home. Ethan felt lighter than he had all day. He had a secret, yes, but he wasn't alone in it anymore. That night, as he lay in bed, he thought about what this meant. He had power, real, undeniable power. But with it came questions. Where had it come from? Why him? And more importantly, what was he supposed to do with it? The following days were filled with discovery. Ethan pushed himself, learning how to refine his control. He could now lift objects without touching them, create currents in the air, and even push things away with enough force to send them flying. The more he practiced, the stronger he became. But with power came attention. One afternoon, while walking home, he was cornered by a group of older boys. They had always been bullies, preying on the younger kids. Ethan usually avoided them, but today they seemed determined. Hey, freak! One of them sneered. Heard you've been acting all weird lately. Ethan tensed. Leave me alone. One of them shoved him. Or what? He stumbled but caught himself. His fingers twitched. The air around him pulsed. The bullies hesitated, sensing something was off. Ethan clenched his fists, willing himself to stay calm. But one of them reached for him again, and before he could stop himself, a burst of energy exploded outward. The boys were thrown back, landing in a heap several feet away. They scrambled to their feet, eyes wide with terror, before running off without another word. Ethan stood there, breathing heavily. He had lost control, and now people knew. Fear gripped him. He couldn't afford to be reckless. If the wrong people found out, what would happen to him? He hurried home, heart pounding. That night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He had power, but he had to be careful. Because if he wasn't, he wouldn't just be different, he'd be dangerous. And he wasn't sure he was ready for that.